In this video we're going to introduce a really critical concept for our programming knowledge, and that's the idea of functions or modular programming. It's the idea of writing some instructions that we can package together and give a keyword or a name for our function, and then we can reuse them throughout our program. We've already used functions many times before, especially when we've been using things like Microsoft Excel. These function names that we have here, they're exactly the same concept as what we'll be doing in Python. You have the name of the function, and then in the brackets you can put in some information that will go into this function. It will do something that's not immediately obvious when you're just using the function, and then it will return some value. Our functions in Python will work the same way. So why do we use functions? It enables us to improve the structure of our program, and it also allows us to make our programs more efficient by reducing and eliminating duplicate code. For example, we've used print, input, int, many other functions in our Python programming. Those are functions other people have written previously, and it would be really complex and time consuming if we wanted to code those individually every time. In the same way, in our programs, one thing that we'll do a lot is check the user's input. If they're typing in a number to make sure it's not a letter, we're going to do that over and over again, and we don't want to have to use a try except block every time. So we can put all of that information into a function and just have it in one place, and then use our keyword to call or to activate that function to make it happen. Some more facts about functions. We need to define them before we can use them. So this is important for how we lay out and present our code. The very first things we're going to put into our code will be our function definitions. They don't actually do anything at the start, but they get read into the program, and so they can be used later if need be. When we use them later, we call it calling the function, and we can call them from anywhere in our code. All that means is we're going to activate and use the functions that we defined at the top of our code. Two more key ideas for our functions is the idea of arguments or parameters. And all this means is we can put information into our function. So just like we had in the brackets for the sum function in Excel, you put in the range of cells you want to add up. In our Python programs we can add in variables, we can add in more information that will then be processed using the function and then returned back from the function to our main program. So if we have a look at a simple example of what a function will look like in Python, this is how we define a function. So you have this keyword def, short for define, then the name of the function, and you can choose this. It can be anything as long as it's not a keyword that's already used in Python. Then you have brackets, and in the brackets here is where you put the names of the arguments or the information that is going to be passed into your function. And then of course at the end you have the colon here, just like at the end of your if statements and your while and for loops. Then just again, like if statements, while and for loops, we use indentation to define what is part of the function. So everything that's indented after that define line at the top is part of the function. So here we're going to take the values that are passed in as num1, num2, add them together, and we've got this return keyword that's going to return the variable total, or the value that's in it. Now a question, if we have this in our Python program, we just run this code, what's going to happen? It's a bit of a trick question because actually nothing is going to happen at this stage because we haven't called or activated the function. It's been defined and it's ready to use, but we haven't actually used it yet. If we add one more line of code down here, this is how we call our function. So you just use the name of the function, and then in the brackets you put the information that you want to be passed in to our function. So here the 4 will be passed in to the variable num1 to be used in this line of code here, and the 1 will become num2, and so our total will be 5 of course, and that will be returned. So what's going to happen if we run this code? Well, this time we're actually going to use the code, we're going to use the function, but we haven't done anything with this return value. So we haven't printed it or we haven't used it in a calculation. So still nothing will be output from our program, but this time our function will run. Finally, if we add this print command, and just like we've had before, anything that we put into the brackets will be printed out. Here we call the add function that we've created using the same parameters as before, and we return the value, which will be 4 plus 1, so 5. So this will print out the number 5. You could also use a full text string like this and then call your function just in place of what you would normally have for a variable. Let's have a look at this code line by line in Python Tutor. So now if we step through line by line, we can see exactly what's happening with this function. When we start, we have our function definition at the top, and as soon as we go forward, you can see that our execution point jumps straight down to here. We ignore everything that's in there. So we've defined it, we've given it a name, so now that when we get down to this line, we can recognize this name and we know what to do. You can see it's been added over here. I click forward again, and now we go back up because I've called the add function. And down here you can see inside add, we've got num1 and num2, which have taken on these values here. Then we're going to go through our function and create the total variable. And you can see here our return value is 5 because we've said return total. And that's now printed out up here because we've got this print statement. Then we go back down to this line, and we'll go through the same process because we're calling the add function again. Back up to the top, create the variable total, and return value 5, and then we have our total text string that's output, including the return value from that function. So a simple example of a basic function, but this will hopefully help you to understand the order that these commands are executed in, and how you need to define your functions at the top of your code, and then you need to call them throughout your code, which will activate and use that code you've defined at the start. It's a big change to the way that our code has been structured. In the past, we've relied on if statements, loops, and sequential instructions to structure our program, and now we're introducing the concept of functions, which can change the order quite drastically. So here's your first challenge for functions. I want you to try and write a program that asks the user to input two numbers, just like the example that we've had, except this time the user is inputting them. Use a function to multiply the numbers together and then return the value and print it out. Once you've got that working, you can try and write the same sorts of functions, but this time for addition, subtraction, and division. And then as an extension, as part of your main routine, so when I say main routine, I mean anything that's not part of the function. And in that main routine, I want you to ask the user to select the numbers 1, 2, 3, or 4, and that would correspond to addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division, and depending on which number they enter, you call the appropriate function. This will require the use of all of the concepts we've looked at earlier, and if you're getting really advanced, you could also put in your try excepts to make sure that they couldn't enter anything that would crash your program as well. So this is a pretty big challenge if you take it all the way to the end, but the concepts at the start will just help you understand the basics of functions. So pause the video now and have a go at that. So here is an example of the first part of that challenge, where I've slightly modified that example that I had before. So I have my function definition at the top. This time I've changed the name to multiply and I've used the multiplication symbol. Then I've added in some input statements. I haven't got any input validation at this stage, I just want to get the numbers in, get the program working. Here I've used the variable name x for the first one and y for the second. Now note how these names for these variables are different to the ones up here. This is to do with the concept of variable scope, and in fact these are what's known as global variables because they're defined in the main routine, whereas these, num1 and num2, are local variables and they're local just to this function. So what that means is if we try and use num1 or num2 outside of that function, it's not going to work. That's why we use this return command to return the total variable rather than just using total down here. So we return the value that we've calculated using our local variables back to our main routine, and then we can use it in our output statement here. This concept of global and local variables we'll go into in more detail in another video because it's quite complicated and it is really important to understand properly, but I just wanted to use different variable names here to make it clear that they are actually different variables. They're not the same even though they contain the same values, or these values from this variable is passed into this variable. Then in our output statement down here, I've used this .format to format my output, and I've called the function using that part of the code there. So that calls and activates this function, which will then calculate my return value and it will display it appropriately. So let's just quickly check that that's all working. So I'll enter 5 and let's say 4, and we should get 20 as our output. So there we go, that's all working. If you've got that one up and running, have a go with the addition, subtraction, multiplication, division ones. Not too hard to change what we've got here to fit those different functions, and then as an extension you could try and have all of them in one place and let the user choose after they've entered the numbers which operation they want to use. Okay, so I'll leave it here for this video. Make sure you do practice these concepts, and in the next video we'll go into a little bit more detail about how functions work and how we can use them in our programs.